Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the second in our School of Professional Studies series on leadership in a time of global crises. Just one housekeeping note. We are monitoring the YouTube chat box. So if you have any questions throughout the program, put them into that chat box. We'll load them into another page that I am monitoring, and we'll address those questions in the Q&A at the end of this session. So there's a geological paradigm. I'm a geologist, so I think in geological terms, but that paradigm is that understanding the past is the key to understanding the future. But as we realize now, our understanding of the past may not be enough when there are events that invert our sense of stability and incremental change. So if the novel coronavirus pandemic has taught us anything, it's that some events are so pervasive in their impact and so global in their extent that they challenge our very comprehension. And so it is with the pandemic, so it is with climate change, and so it might be with geopolitical change on the horizon. In short, the world we think we know is not the world that is going to be. So what does leadership mean in this situation? Well, in the first session of this series, we talked about the need to act collectively to develop broad perspectives and to quickly understand the limits of one's knowledge. We discussed how the notion of leadership has to be adaptive and resilient in the face of global crises, and we brought up the examples, of course, of the coronavirus pandemic and climate change. But tonight, we're going to explore some of the challenges and obstacles to achieving that vision. So the format of the evening will begin with a discussion with Dean Amy Hungerford, whom I'll introduce shortly, and we will then be joined by a panel featuring colleagues from the School of Professional Studies faculty from different programs who will bring their own diverse insights to these issues. And then we'll conclude with this open Q&A and some closing remarks. And again, let me just remind you, monitor or put your questions into the YouTube chat box, which we are going to be monitoring. So this evening, I'm honored and pleased to be joined by Dean Hungerford, who is the Dean of Columbia's Faculty of Arts and Sciences, Executive Vice President of Arts and Sciences, and the Ruth Fulton Benedict Professor of English and Comparative Literature. This is a hat trick of titles, and frankly, paraphrasing Handel's Hallelujah Chorus, we often call her, or somebody in this position, the Dean of Deans. Well, Dean Hungerford joined us from Yale, where she was Dean of Humanities. She's a specialist in post-1945 American literature, and her popular online course, The American Novel Since 1945, if you look at it, illustrates both the breadth and depth of her pedagogy. She's also convened scholars of post-1945 literary and cultural studies through professional associations and online open access discussions. What motivates this discussion this evening is that not too long ago, Dean Hungerford was comfortably situated in New Haven without a clue that among her first responsibilities at Columbia would be the navigation of the COVID-19 crisis. On top of that, Columbia has decided that the university has a special responsibility to marshal its resources to build the knowledge base and the workforce to deal with the climate crisis, and it's forming its first new school in 25 years to do so. So either one of these challenges is a huge lift, and together, well, let's turn to the discussion. So Dean Hungerford, thank you for joining us this evening and welcome to this session.
Thank you, Art. Thank you so much.
You started as a disciplinary scholar, as I mentioned, in post-1945 literary and cultural studies, and you became a leader in your field, not just a scholarly leader, but also an epistemological one, writing and publishing, starting journals, and founding associations of like-minded scholars. How did your transition from leadership in your field to first the Dean of Humanities at Yale and now Dean of Deans at Columbia? Was there anything about how you approached disciplinary leadership that served as the foundation for broader institutional leadership?
Yeah, that's a great question, Art, and for an audience of folks in SPS and associated with SPS, people who think really seriously about what it means to be a professional actor and citizen. I welcome that question. So just greeting the audience in that way. Disciplinary leadership was something that I actually loved as a ordinary professor. And the reason why I loved it was that it required that you be intensely collaborative, and the lines of authority were never very clear. I mean, this is a critique of academia, but also one of its pleasures is that in a room full of thinkers, be they undergraduates, graduate students, professors, postdocs, alumni of your program, colleagues from other places, it's really the best idea, the most interesting question, or the most telling anecdote, or the new piece of evidence that suddenly takes the floor and demands attention, rather than the person with the highest title or the most years behind them in the field. I have always loved that about academic life. That's probably an imperfect and sort of utopian vision of academic life, but in its best moments, that's what I sought to cultivate in conversations in my discipline, of which I was a part. And it's what I liked about and what I found interesting about leadership. So when hierarchy is not the first order of the day, leadership has to depend on other kinds of values, and it depends, I found, on commitment to a shared conversation, even when it's hard, commitment to asking questions when you don't know the answer already, genuine questions, and to admitting the limits of your knowledge. I mean, I noted in your introductory remarks that your first session in this series kind of highlighted that fact, that sort of humility of where your knowledge ends and you need news from other parts of the human enterprise to help you solve problems or address new questions. That to me is what's exciting about leadership in a discipline. And all of those things I have found essential to leadership, even once you enter the sort of more hierarchized world of academic administration.
Okay, thank you. It's an interesting point, though, that you make. I think that in the absence of hierarchy, there are other qualities that have to be explored. So do any of these explorations present challenges? You come from Yale, obviously. You're coming to Columbia, you're presented with new circumstances, both in the hierarchies themselves, the structure, how you're perceived in your position. But how did you actually identify where you might have an impact in, say, having those shared conversations or generating or expressing the sorts of humility that would allow you to identify the challenges and obstacles in leadership? What tools did you use to respond to those?
Yeah, no, that's an interesting question. So, you know, in my academic life, it depended a lot on demonstrating respect for thought partners who were located in all the different pockets of the discipline. We were talking about hierarchy in teaching graduate students, for example. One of the most pleasurable and distinctive things about the way I went about that work was to establish reading groups that read each other's work in progress. And in the way that we tried to conduct those conversations, there was real tolerance for disagreement across anyone in the room. And I would put my own messy work in front of those students and encourage them to pick it apart and ask hard questions in the same way that we all would when they put their work on the table. So empowering those who might not feel empowered to express their opinion or to have their knowledge come to the table and influence an outcome, that is critical to to leadership in every area, I think. So, there's a problem that I'm working on in my budget work right now in arts and sciences. And it has to do with how revenue from a certain part of the enterprise comes in to benefit the whole. And, I have certain views on this, other people have divergent views. So I knew in trying to bring faculty into the discussion of this particular problem that if I did not have those who I knew differed from me on the basic questions at issue, if I didn't have them having a prominent role in the discussion, that my solution would be both less good in an objective sense and also less politically acceptable to the organization. So, in my academic administrative life, I like to use the tool of the ad hoc committee. And you can think about, gathering a working group in a workplace that cuts across certain kinds of, easier forms of agreement to bring people together who it's critical that you have people who are willing to be in a good faith conversation and to entertain difference, but deliberately being inclusive in that way, I think is absolutely critical.
Not only at Columbia, but of course the professions that our students enter into, they're going to be faced with, well, the COVID crisis and the climate crisis, let alone whatever sort of externalities affect what they're trying to do with their own institutes or enterprises or companies. So given that there are broad challenges in whatever one does, that this notion that you have to express humility and engage others who have differences of opinion, is there anything that we can say, essentially assess as commonalities among these sort of external crises that would allow students to sort of build a toolkit, an internal toolkit that basically goes beyond their disciplinary expertise? What can we learn about the commonality among crises that allows us to build the internal toolkits that will enable us to respond to them?
Yeah, that's I think at risk of giving the predictable answer, flexibility is what's required. I mean, unpredictability is what requires flexibility. I've found, time after time, week after week since March, that my expectations are confounded, either because a pathogen acts in a way that I didn't expect or nobody expected, or people act in ways that I don't expect or nobody expected. And if you're not listening and you're not feeling open to a new set of information coming at you every minute, then you're going to have a hard time. There was a time in my life when, well, it's actually still sort of the time of my life when I only drove really old cars, and not because I was a connoisseur, but because I didn't have enough money for a new car. And the first such car was the $800 Nissan 200 SX that I bought from a fellow graduate student in graduate school. And I had this philosophy that when I was out having adventures, whatever they might be in my old car, that the minute the car broke down, I would say to myself, oh, this is how this day was going to end. I didn't expect that. But instead of saying to myself, oh my gosh, how am I going to do this, that, the other thing that I planned, I would just say like, oh, it was a kind of mental discipline. Something new has come upon me, and now the task is to do my best to deal with it. the other, tip from that time of my life and that particular mental discipline was always have a book in the car with you. But I think that principle of trying to focus on being present in the moment and looking forward, rather than trying to reestablish a set of conditions that you had come to take for granted. There are some conditions that absolutely we must be dedicated to bringing back into being. Students on campus in their dorms, that's one of them, of course. But being flexible in that way, it is a kind of mental discipline, almost an emotional discipline, spiritual discipline, to be open to what the world is throwing at you.
Flexibility is a spiritual discipline. That's an interesting way to think about it. By the way, I empathize with you. I have a 50-year-old car in my driveway, which doesn't work at all. But let's talk, this whole notion of making decisions when things are uncertain, where you're not sure what's going to be thrown at you. I think that's something we can explore with the panel in some detail. But let's talk about university and the way that university itself is structured. We are structured around disciplines, obviously, and all of the degree programs emphasize very deep disciplinary understanding and achieving a level of certainty about what you know. Now, how does that comport with the need to be open to uncertainty? How does that comport with the ability to bring in new information, to be humble, as you say? I like that term as well. To be humble about talking to others about what you don't know. So what should the university do? How do we modify or deal with the notion that we need both deep disciplinary understanding and breadth to understand our own humility about knowledge?
I think getting to that place where we can feel that we have both that flexibility and that structure in the use of knowledge or the production of knowledge requires a couple of things. I mean, one is, the acceptance that you need some structure. And in a certain way, people can lament the fact that the university is organized in a way that sort of is based in a 19th century understanding of the disciplines and of the way knowledge is produced. But it's nevertheless true that what's happening in an English department today, just to use my own field's example, is very, very different from what happened in an English department 50 years ago, 100 years ago. And I think that's true across the board. So given that fact, I don't spend a lot of time lamenting or resisting disciplinary knowledge, because I think that one reason why the disciplines or that sort of construct and institutional structure has lasted as long as it has is that they are flexible. Now, are they flexible fast enough? Are they as open to change as they should be? Certainly not. I mean, I think we could say those are, that's the problem. How can we be more nimble within these structures? And I think that requires cross-disciplinary conversations so that you get that outside perspective. If you gather people around a question like climate change or polarization of opinion or knowledge bubbles, culture bubbles, if you gather people from different disciplinary backgrounds, sociology, literary studies, places where they think about narrative, science, if you gather the various ways of looking at the elephant in the same room, you might have a better purchase on the elephant once you're done with that conversation. I think it's a dedication to that continual re-examination of our tools, the lens through which we see a problem. And truly, I think you only get that by listening and learning from people who don't see it the way you do. I mean, it's sort of back to the original sort of thought about what leadership requires. It's true in disciplines too. I think that's why interdisciplinary centers, institutes, conversations, seminar series are absolutely critical to the vitality of the university. Even as I don't think they need to replace disciplinary structures as long as those structures remain flexible.
And one of the interesting notions that that brings up, I think, when we are in a university, all of us on the stage here, as it were, are academics of one sort or another, but we're invested in this continuing knowledge change, the continuing evolution of the set of facts and theories that give us some understanding of the world. But when you're a student and you're going off into a professional career, you receive a diploma after your time at Columbia or Yale, and in some sense, that's a marker in sort of what you've accumulated in terms of knowledge base. How do you think Columbia could assist our graduating students to develop these sort of lifelong learning principles, the curiosity that allow them to see the evolution of their own strengths?
Yeah, I find that allowing students to have a sustained experience of research is one way to do that. And that's sort of a dry and academic way of putting it, to use that word research. But I think we have to learn how to teach ourselves throughout our lives. And that's what I think research is learning how to teach yourself, learning how to ask the right questions that push your knowledge further. And that, that sounds like a very individualistic activity. It is not. Reading is the encounter with another mind, talking to experts, looking out to the field, to people's lived experience. All those things come into this process of learning how to learn. And so I think in any degree program, some deep experience of learning how to learn, rather than simply receiving the learning from a professor, is critical. And I think good pedagogy at SPS and throughout arts and sciences recognizes that, both in the small and in the large. In the small, individual assignments in courses are often, asking students to go out and seek information that's not on the syllabus and bring it back to the classroom for discussion and integration. But most degree programs also have a capstone project of some sort that requires that level of independence. Those structures of curriculum are, I think, critical to providing those skills to our graduates.
Well, thank you, Dean Hungerford. I think this last discussion that we just had is a challenge not just to the students, but to the faculty as well, to note that this is about learning to learn, as you so rightly put it. We're going to turn now to our panel. And let me introduce the panel, take a few minutes to do that, because it's rather distinguished. And I hope, Dean Hungerford, that you can join us as well. We're going to be joined by Professor Siddhartha Dalal, who is a professor of professional practice in the SPS program in applied analytics. Professor Beth Fisher-Yoshida, who is a professor of who's the academic director of the Masters in Negotiation and Conflict Resolution, and is also the vice chair of the SPS faculty. She's also affiliated with Teachers College in one of their centers on conflict resolution as well. She has a considerable background in resolving conflict, which is always an appropriate capability to have at Columbia. Professor Edward Hoffman, who's a lecturer in SPS. He is now the CEO of Knowledge Strategies, but he was also the former Chief Knowledge Officer of NASA, National Aeronautics and Space Administration, high-level institution, enterprise that takes knowledge as its basis of existence, in fact. And then Professor Andy Refkin, who is the director of the Initiative on Communication, Innovation, and Impact at Columbia's Earth Institute. Professor Refkin, Andy, is also a journalist. Yeah, he was for a long time associated with the New York Times. He has put together a bunch of social media challenges and programs and discussions, and has taken full advantage of issues having to do with communicating very difficult concept as well. And they'll be part of our panel. So with the panel on board now, let me assure myself that everybody is there. There we go. Thank you. Okay, then. So let's begin with Professor Dalal. Uh, Professor Dalal, you're an expert in many areas of technical knowledge and technical basis. Why don't you give us a bit of your perspective on this issue of leadership? What are the sorts of issues that you would approach from your position as a professor in applied analytics?
Thank you so much, Arthur, and thank you, Dean Hungerford. You just gave a fantastic view of what are the important challenges of the leadership. And you really talked about the idea of incorporating knowledge from others and getting others on board in some fashion. And that just brought me something very, very quick that obviously as the problem complexity increases, then are there any structured way of thinking about this? And two immediately comes in mind, which are partly based on statistical and artificial intelligence kind of thinking, and which are related to, obviously, many of you might have heard already about wisdom of crowd and the idea of incorporating multiple opinions and coming with the best decisions. And obviously they have been all generalized in terms of what are known as prediction markets. And in fact, there is even more to it, where in fact, one can go deeper in the knowledge about why, what one is thinking about. And at Rand Corporation, where I was a CTO, I created a system which was looking at expert elicitation within a context where in fact you would know and you could actually get expertise from all over the world. So those are the kind of things which you just talked about, a little bit about the internal toolkits, and some of them could be useful. But let me go a little bit deeper in terms of AI related things. So clearly there are very complex decisions which Dina Hungerford is dealing with. And if you go to climate change, and if you go to pandemic, and so on, it's even more complex, and it has got multiple potential outcomes, and there are sequences of outcomes. And so one has to, in some fashion, if you were to think about it, one has to think a little bit about sequences of outcomes, and there are uncertainties associated with this kind of outcomes. So really what is required is to solve this kind of problem is to think a little bit more about what kind of data could be valuable, whether it's coming from experts of various types, whether it is coming from past data. This is where things like Bayesian networks and things which are related to machine learning could be helpful. And actually, if you look at a lot of stuff related to climate change as well as things related to pandemic, a lot of models are coming directly from those kind of thinking. But at the same time, when you execute, you really want the whole team to be part of it, because there is no way to execute anything unless you carry other people along with it. So I think that one of the key things which I learned as a C-level executive at Fortune 100 companies was to make sure that there is a teamwork behind it, which is what Dean Hungerford actually just talked about. So let me just go back to one simple example, which I was greatly involved when I was much younger, which was related to Challenger disaster. And I was involved on behalf of National Academy of Sciences. And the key part was that the night before, there was a great deal of debate about whether to launch or not to launch because of low temperature. And there was a strong opinion by a number of people that we should not launch. And they did not prevail. And in fact, it turned out that that actually caused a major accident, and a teacher, first civilian ever in the space, a teacher actually died as a part of that crash. And so we were involved in terms of trying to see if there is any way we could have applied techniques of artificial intelligence. And we showed that there was a 16% chance of a failure already before even they launch. And if such an analysis was done, it could have been extremely valuable. But more importantly, let me turn around and say more importantly, even if you have such a thing, the question is whether, to what extent the team would accept it. So even if you have the best solution, to what extent the decision-making team would accept it and so on. That's where, again, the teamwork and other kind of things would come in. So I'm sure that there are a number of our panel members who would talk a lot more about it. But That's the way I at least can imagine the kind of things which are really required, all the way from toolkits. But toolkits are not the only answer. We need to think beyond that.
All right. Thank you, Professor Dalavi. You've introduced some interesting concepts here, but one of them, which we have not yet mentioned, which you've mentioned, is the notion that there are just fire hoses of data that you now have to take into account. Quantitative, perhaps nondescript in terms of you don't know who's supplying it. And you also introduced the notions of uncertainty as well in that data and the need to have experts sort of parallel the accumulation, the acquisition of data. But let's turn to Professor Hoffman now, who in your position at NASA, you have to deal with a certain amount of certainty with lots of information that is uncertain. So there's really the question of decision-making under conditions of uncertainty. Can you give us some of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I tell you, Art, I was really struck by your conversation with Dean Hungerford in that it was a conversation about knowledge, leadership, and all these factors. And then you mentioned the term commonality of crisis, which I love because it's where we're at and it's where NASA often is when you have a major project. And it brought me back to a conversation I had many years ago with the astronaut TK Mattingly. And it was looking at the results of Challenger and Columbia failures. And what do we know about why missions are successful and why they fail? And he said that there was one thing that he was most concerned about, and it's how people in teams nowadays develop judgment to make decisions. And at the time, I was a lot younger, so I think, okay, TK, he's in his 70s, and he's a mature person who's kind of minimizing the young generation and the reliance on computers and technologies. But as he explained it, he said, you know, during Apollo, the data we got was by hand. We understood it, we lived it, we took the time. So anything that happened, we could see it in all its colors. And when you get to shuttle, which again was 30 years ago, you have machines and you have analysis and you have software doing it. And now you have this great wealth of data. And the issue now becomes, how do you make a judgment about what's right and what's wrong? And we're in an age now where we're so wealthy with AI and with machine learning and with data analytics, which is wonderful. But how do we develop judgment in a world where we get the answers by picking up a phone? And I think it goes to this community, this commonality of crisis, is that we all get our sources of data from different places. We trust them, but how do we learn about what really is the right way to think or different ways of doing it, right? And so I went to Columbia. I graduated from Columbia decades ago. I went to Teachers College. The most important thing after the network was a way of thinking, which is that the ideas come from a community. There's research out there. There are facts. There's also intuition. And from that experience, you get wisdom and different ideas. And I think that's the great challenge. If you look at the tech firms, what they struggle with is human issues. What they struggle with is ethics. What they struggle with are inherently human issues that really smart people may not be learning. So I think that's what I would focus in on. And I, at the time, I didn't appreciate what Mattingly was saying. But years later, to me, it's I get it.
And it's interesting that you mentioned that even the frontier tech firms need to understand the humanities. So there you go, for Dean Hungerford.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
It's an important contribution. But let's turn to Professor Rathganandi. You've worked a lot in communication, obviously. You have a lot of experience in talking to diverse audiences. We have in front of us a situation where we have loads of data. There are loads of uncertainties. There's a question of how you develop judgment or actionable advice from all of this data. There are crises that affect people in different ways and they'll have different responses to them. How does this all get told? How do you make a story that allows decisions to be made and allows progress to be made?
Well, this is a great conversation. It's great that we started with the humanities approach. I love that Dean Hungerford had that moment she described in the car, which is just like the same moment we have facing the pandemic of, oh my God, how did I get to this place? And how do I go forward? And, I grew up, I wanted to be a scientist originally as a kid. Growing up in Rhode Island, I got a biology degree at Brown University, went out in the world and decided to be a journalist because it was a great way to tell the story of science rather than do the hard work of getting a PhD and spending 20 years doing that. So for 35 years, I've been doing what you just described, telling stories. It looks like this in 1988. This was my global warming warning to the world. 1988, it's getting very tattered. 6,000 words of everything I've been writing ever since. 20 years of that time at the New York Times. And I think that I made a fatal mistake that I only really began to understand 20 years into my reporting on climate, which was the first time I interviewed a social scientist, came 20 years into my climate reporting. And that's when I found out that how we receive and reject information has very little to do with the color scheme on your cover. It has to do with your culture, it has to do with the background of the person doing the reading. There was a body of knowledge that I had, as a journalist, had completely ignored. So that, boy, does that illustrate the importance of a well-rounded education, among other things. And I started talking to a lot more social and behavioral scientists and reported on that. And to me, the biggest part of the climate challenge and the COVID-19 challenge is not out there. It's inside the human mind and inside culture. The divisions over masks have nothing to do with, well, in some cases they have to do with lack of information, but they have much more to do with cultural bonds and what's called cultural cognition by Dan Kahane at Yale. And if I hadn't stumbled into that work, I would still be writing prize-winning articles for the New York Times. I wouldn't be at Columbia. What brought me to Columbia a year ago, I went to the journalism school here, 1981, 82. I taught there in 1989 and 90. But I've become so much more convinced that with issues with this scale of complexity and with implicit deep pools of uncertainty, how hot is it going to get by 2100? That's still a very uncertain. We know we don't know that number. We know the range. How high are sea levels going to get between now and 2100? How do you design an airport on a coast knowing that you don't know whether sea levels would be 1 foot higher or 4 feet higher by 2100? That's science. Only is the delineation of uncertainty is as important as the delineation of what we know. And that then leads to, again, the richer body of work and understanding how do you hold a conversation around that. It's way more important to me than how do I tell a better story. So at this initiative that I'm building, which spans the university, really, it's how do you make information matter? That's the first question, not how do I tell a good story? I know how to do that, but I've become convinced that me telling you, I mean, you all are an easier audience to talk to on, including whoever's tuned in on YouTube, than, the full span of stakeholders on something like climate change. So I think I've come to appreciate it the importance of a much broader sense of what the job is and how building a better conversation is, to me, more important than telling a better story. Sharing stories. The fundamental root of the word communicate is the prefix commune. If you go to the dictionary, it's sharing information. It's not me telling you something. And what Siddhartha was, Dr. Dalal was saying about deep uncertainty. I've just held these sessions recently on my Columbia webcast about it's scenarios that you work on. It's a whole different way of talking to stakeholders and leaders than handing them a clean and neat report. It requires sustained engagement. A science advisor doesn't just come in, as several people have been encouraging the Biden administration to make sure the science advisor is at the cabinet level, sitting at that table, building the human bonds that allow information to not only be conveyed, but to be trusted. So you don't get into these situations where it's just sort of an honorific science advisor who doesn't really have any role going forward on these tough issues. And very little of what I just said has to do with journalism. Journalism matters enormously, but it's this shrinking wedge of an exploding array of ways to share and shape knowledge and for impact. So that leads me to, again, the leadership component and the education component are about things like active listening, about what Peter Coleman here at Columbia does. there's a difficult conversations laboratory. I think every discipline should intersect with that. It's work that's at the scale of a local community board to the scale of Congress. Understanding how to hold a difficult conversation feels to me like a primal need right now, more than me coming to a hearing and presenting effective testimony, for example.
Well, thanks. You know, that's a perfect segue to Professor Fisher-Yoshida, who was more about conflict resolution than I think any of us here on this panel. So this notion of communing, if you will, holding these difficult conversations. First of all, how's that skill learned, or can it be learned? But what does it really mean in terms of developing one's career?
Thanks, Art. So I am loving this conversation, of course. And while we have respect for the deep knowledge of each discipline, it's not only what you know, but how you communicate and how you share that information. So if you have a group of people saying, okay, we're going to be a team and we're going to collaborate, and everybody talks in his or her own language of their discipline, they're not communicating across because the framing is very different. So when we talk about collaboration, there are a couple of elements that I think are really critical. And also Sid Dalal talked about complexity. And I think that we have an incredible amount of interdependence. We need each other, and we need to know how to get along with each other. And we need all the disciplines to come together to deal with these really complex issues that we're facing in the world. And we talk about leadership, it really, I think, needs to be relational. There are different types of leadership, but you have to be able to communicate and connect in a very human way with other people you're working with, because you can't do it alone, and you need other people to shine and to come forward and to want to be engaged and motivated, which means the process, and it's talking about, Morton Deutsch talks about the crude law of social relations. So how you do what you do affects the outcomes. You can't be mean-spirited and competitive and then expect this nice collaborative kumbaya outcome. That doesn't work that way. So how you get there is very important in terms of the process of how we work together. And so that means that leaders in organizations and communities, in any kind of universities, in any kind of context, need to do what a good adult learning model includes, which is support and challenge. You need to challenge people to really rise to the best of who they can be, but support them with the proper resources and space, and allow to fail so that they can learn from that and then grow and then continue to produce and be good citizens and be constructive citizens of society.
I'd like to turn to Dean Hungerford now for perhaps some of your reflections on sort of this first phase of conversation. I mean, there is a, if you will, sort of a differential in the way people converse in the sciences versus the humanities, and the old two cultures argument, if you will. You know, I'm always struck by the ways in which you know, the prevailing ethic for success in academia, or at least in scientific academia, is publishing a journal article, and lots of them in journals that are typically read by just a few. You're essentially throwing the knowledge over the fence and hoping somebody picks it up, or perhaps not even caring. So this notion of engagement, something that humanities actually teaches us, is something that perhaps ought to be applied in the scientific realm. You have a thought on that?
Well, Art, I'm delighted to hear you say that the humanities teach that, because I think that's, you know, that's something that humanists are struggling with right now, is the sense that our discourse has in some cases become too specialized. And one of the critiques of contemporary academic humanities is that we too publish in journals and toss that knowledge over the fence and hope that 2 or 3 people will read it. But I have to say, you know, I'm seeing a lot of leadership, and I'm curious with the others on this panel if we see this in science too. I'm seeing a lot of leadership from young people coming up in the disciplines who see their own desire to have an impact in the world as leading them towards really new communication strategies. And there are foundations and parts of the academy and Columbia too that really support those efforts, whether they come from students as I'm noting, or from senior faculty members, everything in between, to build their own tools of communication. I think that true interdisciplinary work really is hard because of that sort of difference in languages. What comes across in one discipline as a kind of major finding can strike another discipline as proving the obvious. And, how do you push through that snap judgment? And this is to Professor Hoffman's point and Professor Dalal's points about judgment. How do you push through that moment to understand what the difference brings to the table? So I think, that's, what Professor Fisher-Yoshida mentioned about these human skills that we need, connecting with the fire hose of data, another hard intersection. There's a wonderful project that being led out of the School of Engineering at Columbia, involving multiple institutions and faculty from across the university, that is trying to think about how to make our climate models better. And one of the problems with climate modeling is that the level of uncertainty, as Andy Rivkin was mentioning, the level of uncertainty about what that temperature will be like in 2100 is really quite profound. And this group is trying to take the more theoretical sort of human judgment of physics and applying it to the statisticians who create climate models today, or who have been pioneering in the creation of climate models. How do you take that fine-grained knowledge of the physicist and marry it to the statistical wizardry of your data cruncher? That, to me, that's a hard problem, and there's a reason why it's a major effort and requires major top-level intellectual effort. I don't have more advice to make that easier, but I think that is the crux of the problem.
Yeah, that's a great example, that particular project, the notion that in some sense we have to learn more about the climate models themselves in some way. Now let me flip that over to Professor Dalal, actually, because you've talked a lot about this, lots of data coming in, and applied analytics ought to be the program that teaches us how to combine all of these thoughts about judgment and uncertainty.
Yeah,
What do you think the future of applied analytics is going to be?
Well, I think it's very, very interesting. And what you're mentioning, as well as Dean Hungerford mentioned, as well as Andy mentioned, is really the whole issue about fire hose of the data. And now how do we convert data to information? And then what do we mean by information? What information is reliable? What information is not reliable? And then how do we fuse humans with computers? The whole idea of symbiosis between humans and computers are the key parts which are going to be critical for future. For example, I really believe that there is a notion about AI which will take over everything. And I tend to believe there is a whole idea completely opposite, which is, relying on the same tools, which I call as intelligence amplification. So the idea behind all these technologies and techniques we are developing will ultimately, humans would be part of all of this. And the whole symbiosis between those are going to get into the world in a meaningful manner. And we're actually, to be honest, at the cusp of it. And we can see things related to information. And more information is good, but more right information is critical. So for example, if you even look at face detection algorithm, and many of these companies, including Amazon and others, had a system where a person of different race was identified as a monkey, and which had everything to do with huge amount of data, but that was not diverse enough data. And so the whole diversity of the data is another part of it that you cannot. And this is where the third angle comes in. How do we think about reliability? Is a fake news? Is there any way to weed out the fake news? Is there any way to weed out other kind of things, which is again, different kind of information? So I think that there is a really huge amount of work which is needed in terms of thinking about data, thinking about uncertainty, and ultimately thinking in some fashion about all of this together, where we can make a right decision and how would human be involved in it. So for example, I'm greatly involved. I'm part of US Army Science Board appointed by Secretary of Defense. And I've been greatly involved in some of those things. And this is where really we're talking about battlefields. And and we're worried about all of this. But at the same time, the critical part is to make sure human beings are part of all of this. Because if we are not, there is a real chance that we might have unintended consequences, which we don't want. I won't go into the details of it, but you can imagine what can happen. So these are the places where there is a tremendous amount of, I think, multidisciplinary part is critical here. I'm not talking about just AI alone, because ultimately we'll have to put it all together. And I truly believe that we need to think about all of this in a multidisciplinary manner, which is what this panel is representing. And Dean Hungerford has been really hungering for it, if I may call that, So I would tend to agree with that. And I think there is a tremendous amount of opportunity for all of us to work together in some meaningful manner.
And this notion of symbiosis is something we could probably spend the whole evening on, but let's turn to Professor Hoffman, because I've always been impressed by the title of Chief Knowledge Officer. And the notion that you have to turn knowledge, data, opinion into advice that can in fact be used. You've talked a little bit about that process here, but what do you think are the essential elements of turning knowledge into advice?
Yeah, no, I have to say when NASA got to the point where they wanted to create an office around knowledge, it was 2010. And I actually encouraged them not to select me because traditionally a lot of focus on knowledge management is a heavy focus on data and taxonomies coupled with people. And my background was heavily learning, heavily working with teams, heavily working with the project community. And they said that's exactly what they wanted. They wanted that integration. And so I think my message, and it goes back to one of the things I was smiling about in terms of your comment around the importance of the humanities, is that it's really vital that we get away from what I see as a specialization bias. This notion that you have to have a certain education to really be successful in an entity. NASA is obviously an engineering, a science organization, exploration. One of the finest leaders they ever had was a senior executive for human exploration. And her name was Lynn Klein. And she was responsible for being the leader of the group that was setting up the negotiations for the International Space Station. And one day I was talking to her, I said, how'd you get to NASA? Expecting the usual story. And she said, my background is, I was an English major. And I said, Lynn, how did you end up running human exploration for NASA and doing International Space Station? And she said it was the craziest story. And what she said is she was a student, I forget the school, but NASA was just starting the International Space Station. They were having challenges with the French. And a smart person in Washington said her background is in French studies. And maybe she will give us some understanding of dealing with the French. And she said from there, she just did work. And they liked her work. And then she was asked to get involved in international relations and then negotiating International Space Station. And she was great at that. And then senior executive at human exploration. And what I found in my life is a lot of the best leaders, they have very strange backgrounds because they're forced to have different perspectives. They have to accommodate a different environment, but they gain kind of, I think, a wisdom from, again, the different judgments that they get. And so I think sometimes we encourage students, or society does, to, if you want to be an astronaut, this is the path. If you want to be a Silicon Valley entrepreneur, this is the path. When a lot of the best organizations is that they look for people with differences who can make a presence. And this support for the diversity of perspectives, I think, is really vital. That's what I see with the best firms and the best teams, is that they have people with really different backgrounds. So yeah, I should have gone into the humanities. I probably would have ended up as the head of human exploration. So that was.
Well, thanks for that.
Yeah.
Well, SPS should develop a master's program in strangeness as well. Andy, I want to finish with you, give you the last word, as it were. Turning to Professor fisher-yoshida, I mean, your whole area of study really is on getting strange people to talk to one another, or people with, shall we say, antagonistic views, and understand each other in a productive way. What can we learn from some of the basics of your discipline?
It's interesting when you talk about strange paths. When people say, how did you get involved in this field? I say, well, it wasn't my intention, but then, you sort of meander. And looking back, it looks like it was very planful. But I think one of the core pieces that we teach, that I believe, and I think is life work, is really about developing self-awareness. You need to know who you are. You need to know your values. You need to know what's important to you. And if you do, you can develop a sense of confidence, because then you know what's for you and what's not. One of the challenges I know a lot of people have is they end up in jobs they think they want, but there really isn't a fit with the organization and the culture and so on. So you really need fit, which doesn't mean there's absence of conflict. And there are different cultural measures about what success is, and you need to understand what that means to you, and not just to buy into a paradigm or a picture of what other people think success is, but really what you feel comfortable with. And that comes with knowing yourself. And so sometimes people have a very win-lose mentality and orientation, and it really is about, there's room for everybody. And when I think about people having a scarcity mindset, I'm thinking, really, there's so much to do in the world. There's so much a need for all of us. There's plenty for everybody if we have that kind of orientation. And then the other piece, just looping back to the whole idea about complexity and pandemics and crises, is that you really need to develop a sense of comfort with ambiguity. The world is more and more complex. We do not know what's happening. We have the best laid out plans, and then you have to prepare for contingencies. Like Dean Hungerford was saying, well, this is how my day was going to turn out, because you just don't know. And you have to be able, as we talk about, pivoting. So you need to have that level of comfort with ambiguity there. And that all comes, I believe, from self-awareness. And it's a loop. As you are in more ambiguous situations, you learn more about yourself, you see what you're dealing with, you like it, you don't like it, you change it. And that's a lot of the skill set that I think people need to develop going forward.
Thank you, Beth. Andy, I want to turn to you for the last word, but let me contextualize it a little bit. So President Bollinger has come out with this, I think, a very strong statement that the traditional university has as its function research, education, and service to the disciplines, as it were, our own professional service. He's adding what he's called a fourth purpose, which probably more recently we should be calling directed impact. This notion that the university has more to give than just research, traditional education, and service. And so it really is a change. And in developing something like the climate school, or developing a program that gives our workforce the tools our graduating folks, the tools they need to be leaders in complex society, this notion of engagement and the communication that follows is really important. When we talk about things like executive ed, that's just one example. I'd like to think of that in terms of engagement, not just education, because we have as much to learn from the people that are making these decisions, and how that might talk our own scholarship and educational work. But can you put that in the context of how we get the message across that leaders require this sort of transdisciplinarity, this sort of broad perspectives, and as Professor fisher-yoshida says, how do we get across the notion of ambiguity?
Oh boy, I think in my year here so far, as I said earlier, I keep stumbling into magical places like the Difficult Conversations Laboratory and Teachers College, the work they're doing on education design. There's a young doctoral student there who's also working in the disaster preparedness group, who wrote a big paper on climate pedagogy, a new way to think about the climate problem. And what I see lacking, as we've talked about earlier, and this is true in society, it's true in getting the Forest Service to talk to the Department of Interior, to talk to the state of California about wildfire. You can't, it's all disciplines, all agencies. Every issue we're talking about spans disciplines and agencies. Racism is, as a structure, is something that is not a fixable problem. So what is required is crosstalk. It's not so much messaging or even tools. It's empowering, encouraging, building capacities so that faculty in different disciplines can teach together in an agile way, can build a course that still fits into the degree requirements, that gets students knocking their heads across disciplines who might never talk to each other otherwise. So the internal job I think I have here is in this initiative is to create that fluidity. So you still have the disciplines, you still have people who are deep, but you have cross connections, some of which might be felt like is something you would do reluctantly. But I still have yet to find a faculty member or a student who isn't intrigued about the possibility, collaboration. The incentives can be grants and the like. NSF, you look at the flow of grants into all of our disciplines in the sciences, they're talking about transdisciplinarity. So how do you create the teams to pursue the grant? You have to have that crosstalk. And then the other key component, as everyone has mentioned, is connections to the outside world. And this is not, it's great to have a good press office. We have a great one at the Earth Institute, for example. But it's also great to boost the capacity and understanding of everyone on campus, that they have some capacity, whether it's through social media to get over the fear factor there, and there are ways to do it, or to go to a city council meeting or a borough meeting to get people to engage in their communities when there is a physical presence to happen there. Getting people to enabling, empowering, opening doors, reducing barriers to those things can create the kind of fourth purpose impact we're talking about. There are big, clunky design questions. The universities have been designed for centuries to be a knowledge factory. The title professor is, I profess, you absorb, you either fail or succeed. That's so 18th century. It's not got a good fit for the 21st century. I think we can do lots without thinking about undoing that entire system. And I see examples of this every day. I'm trying to get students and faculty to think about using this platform I've developed, which is similar to what we're doing here now, to talk about their projects with the public, to talk about their projects with students at other universities. The capacity is limitless. The impediments are huge. The media, meaning the news media, are a very limited and constrained and problematic part of this landscape right now. And we're working with them too to see if there's ways to shift even the New York Times from telling you the state of the world to co-learning the state of the world, because it's complex. Fitting a complex problem in a page one story, which I tried to do for 30 years, is not, is actually distorting the face of the world. So we all have a lot of work to do,
Right.
But it's good work.
It's fun work. It's fun work, but it is a lot of work. All right, then. Let's turn to the audience Q&A, participants Q&A. And again, let me just remind you to put your questions into the YouTube chat. We have people monitoring that box, and they'll pop up on my screen. There's one particular issue that was brought up by one of our participants, Jadson Santos, as a matter of fact. And it's interesting, we haven't discussed it, even though it's front and center in society right now. We've talked about diversity in opinion, in knowledge base, in advice, knowledge, and how all that gets integrated. But what about real diversity? We're talking about racial and cultural diversity. How do you think that contributes to our understanding of complex problems? I think any one of you could actually talk about this, but actually let me start with Professor Fisher-Yoshida. the notion of diversity in the context of, say, these difficult conversations, what it can contribute to the collaborative mechanisms that we have to employ.
So one of the things that I think gets in the way of us being able to have those kinds of conversations with diverse populations is access. And so if we stay inside the confines of Columbia University, we don't always have access, and people do not have access to us. So that's why we need to go out into the community, and we need to go out into the world, and we need to be open. And one of the things I do as part of the consortium at AC4 in the Youth Peace and Security program is we go out and we work with youth leaders around the world, and we're doing projects in Colombia, and we're working with grassroots leaders and people in government and all of that to hear different voices, different perspectives. And that goes across racial lines, it goes across religious lines, it goes across age lines, right? Because people have different perspectives. So you need to create the forum for people to gather, and it needs to be a space that's safe. So we do something called a social lab. It needs to be a space where everybody's voice is respected, which leads back to the difficult conversations. So, but everybody has to feel safe. So you have to figure out what is that space that allows people to show up and show up in ways that they can contribute. Coming to the ivory tower of Columbia is not always that space, because people sometimes feel inhibited from being able to be comfortable and really be their true selves. So we have to create those spaces for those conversations to happen, because different backgrounds bring different perspectives that are really crucial for us to know and understand.
We see that in the data, actually, certainly for COVID, where the disproportionate impacts on diverse communities are absolutely apparent. And obviously we have to structure a response in that context. But there, I think, as you noted, Beth, there doesn't seem to be that sort of safe space for that to actually occur outside the, if you will, the pasteurized version of the data that's being analyzed in some way.
Can I jump in on that?
Please.
You know, it seems to me too that there's, you know, the basic diversifying of our student bodies and of our faculty within the university is still incredibly important. And one of the pieces, just to this data point, is that I think we don't do a good enough job making the quantitative fields accessible to diversity of gender and background, race, ethnicity background. I think some of the problems that beset big data, as Professor Dalal noted very acutely, come from the fact that we have such a lack of diversity in those fields. So, you know, I think that attending to access to all those kinds of tools, combined with creating the conditions, as Beth has noted, creating the conditions under which people can participate. I think all those things are critical.
We had a study at Columbia some years ago in which we looked at the, if you will, the socioeconomic impacts of natural disasters. And if you would say plot one measure of impact against a measure of size for a natural disaster, this is what a scientist would do. They would expect to have a cloud of points that could converge to some sort of middle line of some sort. You would expect greater impacts for larger disasters. That is generally true, but the dispersion in that cloud of data is almost solely due to socioeconomic and cultural factors, less so engineering factors, say. Really an amazing thing that I think woke up the eyes of many of us in some of the disaster analysis world, that this diversity of opinion has to extend into the we have to understand what the communities themselves are facing and bring those communities into the scientific process or the analytical process as well.
I think you're also, it's really, this is a major issue, right, in organizations and academia and society. And one of the things with organizations that I see is that they talk about the importance of diversity, of inclusion, of collaboration, but then they don't incentivize it and they don't resource it. So what do I mean by that? Let's go to a university. what a university does naturally that's great is that it creates places where small groups of people come together in classrooms and places where they talk, they exchange, they have different ideas. How do we create an environment, though, where we're encouraging how we share learning? Do we help each other in terms of moving forward? Do we grade people to a certain extent on how we collaborate? Or do we grade them on how they compete and who does best in other things? So it goes beyond let's just get people there and hope they figure it out, because we have a lot of incentives that create kind of competitive environments. And so I remember years ago, GW Professor Jerry Harvey used to say he would grade students on whether they helped others during their exams. And so it gets into interesting things, but I think the incentives and the behaviors and how we create safe environments that promote conversation and diversity becomes really important. And that needs resources at all levels.
Well, as Dean Hungerford knows, Columbia is committing resources, but it is a very difficult lift to bring that in, particularly in the technical fields. One aspect, if I may mention, is that in some sense, the stakeholder impact is one driver of diversity in the dominant field, say medicine. You get diversity in medicine because of these disproportionate impacts. If the rest of the technical community takes into account these disproportionate impacts that are not technically driven, but driven by socioeconomic differences and cultural differences or racial differences, that may improve it as well.
You know, one thing I may add, if I may, was really, this is a very important problem, of course, you know, as we all would agree. And I think there are clear indications that diversity actually helps in terms of making better decisions. I mean, it goes back to Francis Galton and his weighing the bull and large number of people coming with a right decision. So clearly diversity is very, very important. I think there are two parts to it. One is, of course, a little bit 5 years, 10 years kind of horizon, which is where it would move slowly as we have been moving, which is not a great way of doing it. Another way to think about it is that the whole explosion of media and social media, to what extent we can bring it and to what extent we can use that as a diverse knowledge in terms of variety of ways we think about it might be another potential opportunity. I'm not completely sure I have the right way of coming with a best way of doing it, but I think that there is a potential where we can now aggregate across the communities, across the world, across races, across continents, and maybe there is a hope of doing something meaningful in that space. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, that's a very good point, but I want to return to you because there's another group of questions, interesting ones. We haven't talked a lot about education before students get to the university. In other words, what does the pipeline look like? And let me ask you, Professor Dalal, you teach the technology of information, if you will. What can you have to teach technology. Can we use technology to teach? Is that an appropriate use of technology?
Sorry, would you just repeat your question? Some other you trade off.
You teach technology. Can technology be used to teach?
I think that's actually very, very interesting question. And actually there is a lot of effort which has gone in terms of how do we, if the world of tutoring, and how do we make the world, what are the tools which we could create in the world of tutoring? So there has been a tremendous amount of work which is actually going at a number of places in terms of what is the best way that students are likely to acquire the knowledge in the shortest amount of time and so on. So there is a whole field which has actually emerged called intelligent world of tutoring. And there has been, actually there are some key ideas related to what kind of material, what kind of media, and how do you deal with it. And that actually has been a fascinating field. So if anybody wants to follow, you might want to just type in intelligent world of tutoring and you will find substantial number of new things which are going on in that particular space. And they are all related to all the way from not only you're teaching, but you're giving even counter to what you might be teaching to allow people to create new ideas as a part of it.
I would never want to give up my human TA, but perhaps at some point he or she.
Sure. Absolutely.
There's
Can I
no.
offer a very quick thought?
Sure, Andy.
One other aspect of how to get below the level of higher ed is the tremendous potential to develop models around something like deforestation, through which students at any level can be playing an active role in either research or in monitoring of what's going on in the Amazon. We did a session earlier this year with a very smart guy I've known for a long time, Dan Hammer, who has something called Earthrise.education. It's actually, that's now a suffix. And students in Massachusetts and in Iowa were actively scouring satellite imagery of the Amazon forests around the Yanomami Reserve and created a database that was used by Reuters to create a pretty impactful story on illegal mining incursions into the reserve territory. And that just shows you, and I've been working with Dan since then to see how we can amplify that, or what other levels or elements can be brought in. Imagine graduate students and undergrads and high school students anywhere can participate actively in work that's meaningful and impactful in the real world. It's got the fourth purpose built into it. It's got an interchange with indigenous communities. And that, by the way, the other thing that can happen now, this is, I wouldn't call it, there's no real upside to the COVID-19 pandemic tragedy, but the connectedness we have that now is so demonstrable, where there aren't gaps in connectivity, allowed me a month ago to have a live conversation with another tribe in the Amazon. And it could be in the classroom at any level with interpretation potential. So there's limitless possibilities to engage the disengaged communities, the ones who are most affected by climate change, who are most vulnerable to pandemics, with a focus on the digital divide, of course, making sure that policy-wise, people have this equal opportunity for access to this connectedness. But this is a great moment for innovation on that front.
Thanks, Andy. Actually, I might return to you with this next question, but let me actually start with Beth and turn to Ed on this. And it raises an issue that Amy talked about in her remarks earlier. This notion that hierarchy sometimes means that you're not getting all of the information you need, that somehow that you have to get beyond the hierarchy and the, if you will, the impulse to stay quiet if you're not in hierarchy. So this question pertains to how do you communicate? If you have your own initiative, if you have your own sense of leadership on a particular issue, how do you communicate that up the hierarchy, particularly if that hierarchy is, shall we say, somewhat static in its own perception of the problems? Beth, do you have a sense of how you might go up through an enterprise to communicate issues?
So there has to be, going back to the safety issue, and there has to be an invitation for that kind of commentary, right? There has to be a willingness for people in senior positions up a hierarchy chain to really be open to hearing from other people. Because one of the things that I know in the consulting work I've done in organizations is people on the front line, just as you've given little, the rocket NASA situations, people on the front line know exactly what's happening in a much more visceral way than people who are more removed because they're in leadership positions. So people in leadership up on the hierarchy have a broader strategic view. So they have other certain kinds of information that are very crucial, but so do the frontline people. So there has to be that communication back and forth, which means there needs to be safety and a lower risk. The hurdles have to be taken away or lessened, because otherwise people will feel if I say something, almost like the emperor's new clothes, right? If I say something that might be controversial, I could be punished for that. So retribution in organizations is a very real thing, and many people don't want to say something at the risk of being ridiculed or have retribution against them. So that stops that really important information from going up the ladder.
Ed, both you and Sid actually talked about the Challenger disaster, but that must be a particular experience within NASA about how to move uncomfortable information up the hierarchical ladder. Do you have any insight on that?
Yeah, I think, so first of all, I agree with what Beth said, to me, that's the notion that a leader, and how do we develop leaders, becomes very, very important. Really needs to create a culture where there's an openness to talking, to conversation, to engagement, psychological safety, right? But if you're the individual who's down lower and you're trying to influence upward in what's a typically hierarchical kind of a place, to me, the best way it happens is if that organization gets into crisis, if they have a problem, if they have a significant challenge, and if you and your team has a solution, that usually is a direct path to that openness. And so I think that's a key aspect of it. And relating to things like the Challenger disaster, I mean, it's been studied, and there's so many case studies around it. The failure there was creating an environment where, despite the fact that people saw things, despite the fact that engineers tried to raise issues, despite the fact that there was data there, in an overly controlling management environment where it's not safe to say we have a problem here, it contributes to, and it ultimately causes that. So, but I think it's both ways. What I looked for, and what I still look for, is when there's a challenge there, and look at COVID, right? Look at what's happened in terms of the development of the vaccines and the coming together. It probably couldn't have happened without a sense of urgency. So when you're in an organization, look for the problem, look for the challenge, develop your own expertise, work with others, and then look to see if there's open access.
I would actually agree with Ed and Beth. Actually, it's very interesting about Challenger. And in some fashion, really, there were cultural issues. Cultural issues were where only people who could be successful at NASA originally were only people who were rocket scientists. So if you were anything other than rocket scientist, you better learn to become a rocket scientist, because you had no future without it. And it was very interesting that when we started our work, when National Academy of Sciences and National Research Council and everybody really talked about the work which we did, it actually made I think Ed is completely right. Without a crisis, they would have never thought about it, okay, to be honest. And after the crisis, they started now taking a lot of different steps to diversify the knowledge base by trying to hire and not try to, not only after hiring, but not after hiring, don't make them all rocket engineers, but allow them to do other things along with it, was a critical part of it. So I would tend to agree that the organization at times becomes static, although they might be at the top of their technology echelon. I'm not trying to say they're not, they were at the top of their technology echelon, but they had forgotten beyond that there were other things which needed to have a diverse way of thinking about it. And I think that was one of the key part of the lesson which I saw personally when we gave presentation to NASA and presentation to National Academy and other kind of things. It was very, very critical.
Totally agree with what Sid's saying. That's why risk is so important. We can go on that. But one of the dangers is that when people and when teams and societies think they're smart, it's really hard to work with them.
Yeah, exactly.
Because they take it as a pride point that I don't need help from you.
Yeah.
What are you going to teach me about? When I got to NASA, it was from Columbia, and I'm talking to folks in the Apollo era, and one of the first questions I always get is, what are you going to teach me? I've been on part of the team that went to the moon. And that's the danger, that when you get really smart, or when you think you're really smart,
right,
you start excluding data points or people who are not part of that community. It's a human issue, it's a cultural issue, and it's real.
Yeah, can I just jump in on that? You know, I have always found that relationships, this goes back to some of our earlier points, that relationships are key conduits of information that's uncomfortable coming up a hierarchy. And I think, you know, what everyone in leadership needs is that that wonderfully wise, tactful, judicious gossip. You know, it's sometimes messy how uncomfortable news can come, uncomfortable truth can come from the ground level of an organization to more abstracted leadership positions. And I just think that those relationships of trust that certain people are just very talented in building, or you know, in my own experience, people who know how to navigate social media and can access the different conversations that may be happening out of sight of an organization, and yet have become safe places for people who don't feel heard in the organization. There are sort of negative versions of that, but there are really valuable versions of that that I think we ignore at our peril and need to actively seek out.
Let's actually let's conclude. There's so much more that we could talk about, I'm sure, but let's conclude on that very cogent concluding remark, Dean Hungerford. That's very nice. You know, in review, I think what we've tried to get across is the nature of the complexity itself of dealing with complex information and complex crises. That there are a set of skills that are required, and a set of, probably more importantly, humanistic attitudes that are required in being a good leader. The notion that one has to be open, that one has to be able to ingest diverse opinions, that one needs to acknowledge diversity, that one needs to know what one doesn't know and needs to know that very quickly, particularly in an emerging crisis. We're going to be talking a lot about this in our next two sessions as well. Our next session is scheduled for February 18th, where we're talking about the notion of anticipation. In some sense, we've been reacting to the pandemic. We seem, frankly, to be reacting to the climate crisis, even though it had been anticipated. What is the nature of anticipation, and how do you deal with the uncertainties associated with anticipation and turn that into a leadership moment? I do want to conclude by thanking the team that has made this all possible, starting, of course, with our panel, and Dean Hungerford, many thanks for joining us this evening as well, but also including Beth Semia, who couldn't be here tonight. She's the Associate Dean of Academic Affairs and has really been bulldogging this series. And our technical, media, and events management team, Kira Stockdale, Angie Frere, Michael Eder, Jonathan Ori, and Peter Lee have been behind the scenes keeping this thing going. So thank you all for your attention. I hope you got as much out of this discussion as certainly I did, and as I hope the panel did. And we hope to see you at future sessions.
And thank you, Arthur, for all the things you have done.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.